class. So this assignment, you're photographing the same person 2 times. And I purposefully left this assignment, and hopefully all of the assignments, a little bit more open for you. So if you base the 2 different ways that you're photographing them simply off the module reading, then you would have different approaches like fine art, documentary, commercial, editorial, beauty, weddings, corporate, these sorts of different approaches to photographing your subject. And then I showed you, I turned in some student images that were successful images. So a student photographing her husband playing the role of the father in this sweet little tent that he created, and then being a person in the Air Force, showing that side of him. So showing 2 totally different approaches. And I also gave you the images of Callahan, right? So he photographed his wife just so beautifully for so many years, and most of those images are all fine art. But we might see fine art intimate portraits. There's a lot of images of her in the bedroom, or fine art abstract images getting close up of her body. And then one of the images actually looked like a documentary image to me. So there's lots of different ways that you can approach this. So one would be that you photograph the same person with different styles in mind. Maybe one is fine art and one is documentary. Or, as we're going to see in this first example with Genevieve, we're looking at the same person and we're photographing them both in kind of documentary styles, right? Here, we're photographing them in their room, in their personal space, but it's not a fine art image. This is more of a documentary image. Let's go over them quickly and then I'll get into the details. And then here, you're photographing also in a documentary sense, but here this is him in drag. So this is showing a different side of his personality. So this is a good example of how you can not be using a different approach to photography, not using fine art and documentary and commercial, but you're utilizing different sides of the same person's personality. So first we have this image of this guy laying in bed. He's looking up at us. It has an intimate feel to it. It looks like you have window light coming in and fully illuminating him, and that's working really well. For him, your point of view makes this a much more intimate portrait. His hands kind of covering up, or him looking and giving you a little bit of a side view. There's something that feels a little bit uncomfortable about this, like we're invading his space a little bit. So that creates another narrative for us. We don't have any metadata on either of these images. I know we're talking tomorrow and we'll talk more about how to get this metadata embedded. And then this image has a totally different feel to it, right? He's in drag. You are photographing him, again, with a really wide-angle lens. I think you have a preference towards the wide-angle lenses. You've pulled him out from the background, so the background doesn't even really matter here so much because you have the flash just on his face, which is flattening out all of his features. And that's why we'll work more with different types of lighting, but it gives kind of a snapshot aesthetic to this image. So it feels like we're ready to go out for the night, and he's dressed up in this drag, and it's a different side of his personality than what we saw in the first image. So this is a good example of that. And then what we have in the next image, these are by Christian. This is another approach to it. So here we have our subject working, it's a fashion student, and he's working on sewing right now. So we have this at ISO 400, 23 millimeters, f3.5 at 1/25th of a second. So really, not a really long exposure, but a long exposure. We can get in there and see the sewing machine. The light that you're using, I would say in general, isn't great lighting, but it has this feeling of him working late. It's the only focus in the room is this light directly on the sewing machine and on his face. The lighting really brings the sewing machine to the forefront opposed to him. It seems like it's more about the machine and less about him. And that's why I think that's why I say it's not the best lighting for this situation. But it also creates a mood of him being solely focused on the sewing machine. We can see it's light outside, but it still seems like this is like shot. He's working like late into the night. There's a little bit of movement on him at that 1/25th of a second, so I would be careful of that. But this is giving us more of a documentary view of him working on his craft. And then the next image is much more straightforward, right? We're just photographing him with really hard light on him. And this is more of like a corporate sort of image, right? Where he's just being photographed almost informationally in the approach. The background behind him is just a plain wall. And we're not learning a lot about his personality here. We're just kind of getting a portrait of him. Here he's again shot at 1/25th of a second. So we're having a lot of motion blur in these images, and that's something you need to be aware of moving forward so we don't have this shake. We want to make sure all of the images are nice and still. Also here, I'm curious about the lighting. You're having it really hard coming from above and the side of him. So bringing that a little bit more in front of him, lowering it down, and either diffusing the light, putting something in front of the light, or pulling it further away from him, I think would make more pleasing light on your subject here. And then we have these two images. These are by Linda. You're at ISO 100, 21.4. What a weird measurement there. 21.4 millimeters, f3.2 at 1/8 of a second. So those settings look fine as far as the amount of light hitting the image sensor. But when we look at your subject, she's not quite still. And 1/8 of a second is just tricky, right? For someone to be hanging upside down from 2 bars and be totally still. So here I would pump up that ISO a little bit. I know you're already bringing in, I think you said 2 strobes for this image. So we know you're already lighting this. You're already opening up your aperture as much as you can. You have your shutter speed low. So here we need to start raising that ISO some to be able to get a faster shutter speed so we're not having that motion blur. Especially if she's using this for a business image or something, we want to make sure that her face is totally sharp. We can also see like the movement. It's kind of interesting, like her chest, her legs, her face are moving, but her ear is almost totally still. I don't think that's a focus issue. I think it's just where her momentum was and where her movement was as you are photographing it. But this is a really fun image showing her reflection as she's working on the bars here. This is part of her job. This is part of her business. So you're showing this fitness side of her. Now here, we're again at ISO 100, 18 millimeters, really wide again. F7.1 at 1/30th of a second, a longer shutter speed still, probably longer than I would recommend hand holding. But here, this looks like a completely different person. So the first image feels more like editorial about her work. This feels more documentary, or even we could start to think of it as like a commercial show, like she's getting photographed and she's a paying client. And here she's sitting out on her porch. She's got her dog and like perfectly posed in front of her. So this has a nice, really friendly feel to it. You're using open shade for your lighting, which is working really well here to illuminate her. So this is a nice source of outdoor lighting. One other thing I wanted to mention, because I had talked about this in the discussion area about this image, is the really wide angle. And because this room, it looks like it's a really small room, she's been able to work all of this equipment in. But in the other image, and we see it here as well, it really distorts the room. So we're starting to see the walls feel like they're short, and the door in the first image that you had turned in the discussion area was looking very small. So that's the effect of that wide angle lens, really expanding things, maybe sometimes more than we want to. So I just wanted to make sure I answered that question here.